Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon to wherever you're joining us from, but mainly around Australia. But I do know that we've got a couple of international visitors that have registered. We've got a few people coming in here, Bart. We'll just give them a minute, but we'll formally give you a welcome in a moment. But how are you doing, Bart?
I'm always better when I'm talking to you, Colin.
Very good. So I think we'll probably kick things off. Um, Look, welcome to everyone here today to Field Day Findings, insights from our four family farms. I'd like to welcome Bartholomew Davidson to the microphone today. Um, he's one of our hosts today. Bart is Chief Grazing Officer here at Atlas Carbon and Maya Grazing. Where are you coming in from today, Bart?
Somewhere between Brisbane and Sydney, Col.
It's been lovely spending a couple of weeks on the road with these field days that we've been running, and we're going to today have a bit of an overview of a bunch of field days that we've been running. But before we do, for those not familiar with us, Atlas Carbon, we develop high integrity soil carbon projects in partnerships with graziers all around Australia, and really it's about doing two things really, really well. Firstly, it's working on the viability assessment of a project to ensure that it's stacked up, and then it's all about what you do. You've got to obviously have the nuts and bolts in place and have things going with the regulator and the project set up. But it's all about management. It's all about what are the thousands of good decisions that need to be made on a project over a 25-year period to make it a real success. And then Maya Grazing is a key part of that. It's a product that Bart and I have been working on for the last 10 years or so together. And we're fortunate enough that it's now one of the world's leading performance grazing products. And we're very fortunate that we've grown throughout Australia and North America and have built one of the world's largest grazing analytical platforms over the last decade. And it informs enormously decision making independently of a carbon project, but for those that are working on a carbon project, even more so, as you need to ensure that you're supporting the soil carbon enterprise as well as the grazing enterprise. Um, Feel free to chip in as and when you've got anything to say, Bart, but if you don't, I'll just keep going. We're going to have a really, today's session is going to be about half an hour, 40 minutes tops. I'll give you a brief introduction and we'll go through some of the takeaways of the individual field days that we've been running. There's definitely commonalities across all projects, regardless of bioregions of where we're running these projects, and they certainly are some diverse environments and enterprises. Then we'll get on to some next steps with some other things that we've got on the calendar coming up. But we'd also love to open that up to a bit of Q&A for the crew joining us today. But essentially, the nuts and the bolts of this field days have been, it's really about unlocking and sharing some of this practice adoption on ground. The stories from these four graziers, which we'll go into in a moment, really, they've all been running a project with us for about 12 months now. The combination of them have been working with us with high performance grazing systems over the last 10 years and utilize Maya Grazing as well. Really, it's about looking at some different bioregions, but there's a lot of common principles that underpin the grazing management and also the success of the soil carbon project, regardless of the system, regardless of the bioregion, etc. So we'll be talking about grazing infrastructure a bit about pasture improvement, and also planning for plant recovery, as well as inputs. Effectively, this is all about having production systems that drive the outcomes, both from the day in, day out production that they get paid for with their core grazing system, as well as the production system that ultimately drives the generation of carbon credits and potential monetization of those. We will get cracking because we want to sort of dig into some of the nuts and bolts on each of those operations. I'll take a breath, Bart, and I'll let you jump into the first one. you kick that off, and I'll interject and ask questions um, if you jump off track or what have you.
That will never happen, Cole. Okay. I think just stepping back at a high level, these four farms, in some cases drastically different, in some cases quite similar, but vastly different landscapes, vastly different operators from different backgrounds and histories, and it's a fascinating opportunity. And I'm personally very grateful for being able to spend time with these guys and their families this last little while. Just fantastic to see how people are moving the needle, what they're doing to transition, their view of where they were from to where they want to be, all looking for a framework of one description or another, or have reached a framework of one description or another in terms of how they want to graze, how they want the farm to look in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years, what the language and the communication of that is. And it's almost amazing that they're similar even without knowing each other. So that always strikes me. And I think the other thing that strikes me about these different landscapes and different farms, because they're all very different farms with different rainfall, different soils, etc., that we'll get to, was one of the lovely things was that, and this is what field days not always do, but sometimes do, is flush out the opportunity for neighbours to come along and be on the farm when they generally don't get that opportunity, and ask what's going on. They've been seeing change, they've been seeing movement, they've seen stuff, but they haven't understood. And I heard lots of conversations around that was provided by those opportunities, and it's a fantastic thing to see and be part of. So let's dive in. Let's think about a couple of things Coventry wise, where we kicked off the HIP field days.
Great. So we'll go head up to Tamworth, New South Wales, with Jared and Sue's door.
Yep. And first thoughts for me, in terms of a carbon project, and again, this is not carbon focused. All of these farms, all the discussions that we had on the field days were driven by the fact that these farms are in a carbon project for the last 12 months or so. It was really all about production. And the first thought I have with Coventry is it's got some beautiful soils. It's around Nundle. It's in that sweet spot of pretty good, strong basalt / shrink swell vertisol clays with a cropping history. A little bit further out, so not necessarily always a win on the cropping side, transitioning to permanent pasture. From a carbon project point of view, it really is the sweet spot because it's got that history of cultivation and lowering of carbon to then moving into a really fully fledged grazing operation with vigor and enthusiasm that just lights things up. Because of that history and that combination of elements. And ultimately, I think the theme there, if I'm looking at the theme, I think of Coventry and Jared and the time that we've spent working with that crew. There was a lot of complexity. There was a lot of stuff going on. Jared is the perfect pupil. Jared would have been the best in school. Jared does everything very, very well, and lots of moving parts. And I think that the main theme of the last 12 months has been simplifying, removing elements of complexity that get in the way of doing a really good job of how we harvest grass.
So increasing control bar, this complexity, but this increasing control of what?
At a simplest level, who eats what? How many bites on this plant? How many mouths in this paddock for this period of time? That sounds pretty complex too in its own way, but it's really not. Reducing the number of mobs so that there's more paddocks per mob, so that there's more choices about who. And when I say who, I mean the animals, the mobs. This group of animals, that group of animals. This is a breeder job. It's a high performance breeder job with some pretty special genetics, with some pretty high value partnerships that Jared and his team have developed into the industry. It's a farm that'll run 100 bulls around. It's not your average show. It's got a lot going on from an animal performance point of view, and so the grazing is ultimately the job here. And, the underlying complexity has been lots of different classes of animal needing lots of different levels of attention to feed and time and individual performance for all sorts of good reasons. And the emphasis of, well, Jared's focus and his crew really over the last 12 months is noticeably, if not a couple of years really, has been getting on top of infrastructure, getting on top of the ability to have more even-sized paddocks. Instead of having a bunch of paddocks that are 30 hectares and a bunch of paddocks that are 100 hectares, getting to the point where, I think right now average paddock size is circa 20 hectares. Number of mobs is reduced drastically. The amount of time that animals will spend in a graze event goes from being nearly a month to under 10 days, which is a huge move in 12 months, which means that there's more control and less complexity in how animals are consuming grass.
And what do you mean by a grazing first framework? Because clearly there's a lot of partnerships. It's incredible genetics. There's a lot going on there where animal performance is paramount. Though we're looking at a grazing first framework, how do those things not compete for attention?
Yep. And it's not all about the people, but different people have different levels of complexity in their lives. And I think Coventry is a great example of lots of moving parts, because you got a very enthusiastic, proficient operator here, and really it means if we're going to do everything, we're going to be diluting our ability to execute with precision. And when it comes to grazing or a grazing first framework, it really means, okay, let's get really good at how we harvest grass before we worry about growing more grass. Let's get really good at how we harvest grass before we worry about the species of that paddock versus the species of this paddock. Let's get really good at how we harvest grass before we worry about the differences in quality over there and over there and over there, which is what the farms are doing.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that we only do have a finite amount of time, and I do know that we can talk about Jared for hours because we happened to the other day between Ningen and Coonabarabran almost non-stop. So, but what a day to have people from all around New South Wales. I think there was even someone from Victoria, and definitely had a couple of Queenslanders as well. So people certainly travelled to get to Coventry to see what Jared and Suze are achieving there. Next up, we've got the ponds. Not terribly far away, but a different system, a different setup, different set of complexities. Here we've got the main theme is animal performance, but with the McMurtry's up there, what a day that was.
Yeah, I can't help it, Kyle. You got to go back to that last one. We will be speedy and transition and go through. But if you just go back to,
I'll give you a certain amount of control, but I will exercise my authority even more firmly on the next rotation.
I love your attitude. The grazing first framework is a critical one. It has elements. We're not going to get to the nuts and bolts of them all right now, but it's about basically having control over who eats what and developing a set of metrics that provide a trajectory. And we're going to talk about that ongoing ad infinitum forever, and it'll come up through the other farms as well. But for Jared and Coventry, that really means shorter graze duration, really fundamentally pushing the boundary on recovery. And one of the key take homes for me, I'm just thinking back to the paddock, right? Because I couldn't go to the next slide without thinking about being out in the paddock. And we had a paddock, a native paddock that had been underperforming and had pushed out to 100 plus days recovery, i.e. call it 3.5 months since there'd been a mouth in there, which was a long period of time for Coventry, just to see what would emerge to provide that space for that pasture to have some recovery where it hadn't probably for some period of time, long period of time, and then see what it could do. And then come back in and, looking it up, a harvest of 1.2 tonne of pasture, and then another long recovery, and then another large graze yield coming out of that, where it had really been an underperforming paddock. And it just came from those changes in understanding around the metrics and the grazing first framework that means that there's control over who's eating what and when, to find these boundaries on recovery, find the boundaries on density, another thing we can come to later, find the boundaries on stocking rate overall for a group of paddocks to then get to the point where we're pretty comfortable with what the bulls are eating versus the younger heifers versus the cows versus the weaners, for argument's sake. And that's what's flowing through the management there at Coventry in a wonderful way to see. And whilst building some, demonstrable resilience in ground cover, in pasture sward, in root depth. That was the stuff that we got excited out in the paddock there, whilst also really focused on the grazing. So it's this lovely synergy between pasture, animal, people making the call, and carbon. Righto.
And all within 12 months. And Jared, as and when you either if you're on the call today or looking back at this, please just know that I'm not trying to rush on from Coventry. I can't wait to get back there, but we do need to move slides. Okay, but we're going to move forwards to the ponds. I started to give an intro. We went back to Coventry, but here we are back at the ponds with the McMurtrys. Incredible family, incredible operation, big history, and also a big future.
Yeah, another really proficient operator, well supported with a family that can do it all. An aggregation of farms, so it's a little bit atypical in that, the 4 farms in a carbon project, breeding through to backgrounding through to finishing, big range in soil types, in that Barraba, Bingra region, just a lovely exposure to a really cracking enterprise that's been built by a cracking operator. And theme is somewhat different in that there's a lot more moving parts. If Coventry had a lot going on, I think it's fair to say that that Hughes' team has a lot going on all the way through to the opportunity to finish on farm, take animals through to finishing on farm on spec. That requires a lot of a huge amount of management, and so it really is that priority of management. And again, lots of moving parts means that execution of that can often be easy to dilute in different areas, and it's about strategically, picking the mark and going for it. And for the ponds, grazing is pretty much in the bag. It's really developed enormously. The recovery periods, density, pasture sward strength, it's all happening, right? It's been developed. There's a good language around how animals graze. There's a good language for grazers. There's a good language for describing that across the farm between the people in the business. It's pretty well understood. The next element to that becomes, righto, plan of nutrition, feed quality, having enough paddocks in a paddock group, a cell, a rotation for a finishing mob, for argument's sake.
Let's come back to that plane of nutrition and some of the, where Hugh's heading there, and also, just so I don't have to interject again, just tell everyone what we're actually observing there on the screen, and then move to the impact of what we're seeing there on the screen and how that's the impact on the density is having on seed distribution, on fertility.
Sure.
Yep.
Well, that was a lovely highlight, in terms of the people stuff, because at the end of the day, this is all people stuff and moments in time. Yeah, there are animals and soil and grass and everything else too, but it's the people stuff. I had this lovely memory of a young Zara. I can't recall how old Zara is, but I'm sure she's in high school, moving 1,800 head, somewhere between 400 and 500 kilo steers, without a dog, no mess, no fuss, no carry on, just happened to bump into us talking with a vehicle in the laneway. And I think that was just a fantastic example of the ability to move animals around, yes, with some density. Okay, do the maths. 1,800 head, 3% of body weight, with that day's pasture moving seed around. Yeah, you've obviously got a huge ability to move nutrient and seed and distribute that through the farm. When you're doing that and you've got, circa 50 head per hectare, which is up there from a density point of view, and a great number too from an animal impact on soil in a positive way for short periods of time. Absolutely. And then that becomes the focus that you asked me to talk about there, which is animal performance. And in a business that is finishing, or at the top end of backgrounding, there are some double-edged swords there. There are some tensions around the individual performance and grass performance and soil performance, and the whole deal, and management. So I think, credit to the team there. They've been doing that, and one of the highlights was seeing the opportunity for, let's say, a conundrum that is often faced by people that we work with, where for a high performance bunch of animals, we might have a range of feed qualities from a 7 out of 10 to a 10 out of 10 in the same rotation, because we just happen to find ourselves in that position, because that's what happens when we develop pastures, and they're not all the same, because we throw the kitchen sink over there and we have less development or less time or investment in paddocks over here, but they end up in the same rotation with the same animals over the same, let's say, 100-day period. And that can be a real challenge. And I think that's one of the themes of the ponds, and it's one of the great objectives that's going on there on that particular farm, whilst it's surrounded by breeding jobs as well in that business, to smooth that out. And the grazing first philosophy is aiding that. Then once the grazing is in place, and by grazing I mean those metrics, those numbers around graze yield, graze duration, graze recovery, and then getting into density, to then be able to say, right, let's really work hard here on refining the spread, if you like, in the plane of nutrition, because that's where the money's coming from. That's what pays the bills. That's what is underpinning the enterprise every day of the week, compared to a carbon project or anything else. And that was lovely. That was a real highlight to be working through on that particular day, because there is, a huge dependency on that in that business.
And a real highlight to me too, if we swung that camera around 180 degrees, we'd be looking at a paddock with subtropicals, which didn't look like that sort of rocket fuel that we're looking at in the paddock there. Though when you look at the hard numbers and pull that up on Maya Grazing, an absolute workhorse of a paddock that may not have looked all that fancy, but it was one of the highest performing consistent paddocks on the place.
It's true, actually. The day before that field day, we were working through the numbers, and it's often the tired, bedraggled old pasture that looks like a poor cousin that's actually delivered the most over the last 12 months. We see that quite regularly, and it's that balance, getting those numbers, getting that data to drive those decisions. And I think the ponds represents for me remembering that it's in a carbon project and is intensely focused on being a successful production business. The transition from needing to fill the gap in feed with forage cultivation, variations on that ad infinitum and expense, towards permanent pasture is the end game here. Both from a production point of view, a simplification of performance point of view, that plane of nutrition point of view, and then ultimately in carbon as well at the end of the game there, is a big part of the theme of that field day. It was a cracker.
Thanks,
and
Bart.
Seeing that interplay between animal on the individual side and animal as a tool to change landscape in the graze was fantastic.
Yeah, I'm very conscious of being of time and needing to flick to the next slide, that you dragging me on the earlobe to pull me back to this one. Are you comfortable that we actually can move on to our next farm now?
I think time is a construct, Cole, and I think we can go where we need to go, but let's go for sure. Let's go
there. All right, here we are at Grovedale now. Known Scott for a while. Scott and Karen Brown out there at Trunky Creek. And I remember when we were running the due diligence process and project viability to see, does this thing actually stack up? And I know that Scott said this publicly, and he said one of his favourite days ever on his farm was this day that we were conducting the sampling, etc., and doing that led to the modelling and the project viability assessment to say there's a project here. What you got to say?
Well, I think Scott is the embodiment of why we love doing this stuff. He's just an enthusiastic go-getter that will never say die, and he gets the job done. As carbon projects go, it's on the smaller side for us. It's got just as much intensity, and every hectare matters approach as anywhere else. I don't think there's a metric that Scott cannot provide. He's absolutely a gun on being able to describe the farm in terms of metrics related back to sheep and the value of sheep, the value of wool. So he's really driven to understand his production system. Uh, it's for me, we've been there a few times. That's the joy of going through the whole process of getting to a baseline, and then down the track here we are. The subsequent years, I think the thing that stands out as highlights for this property, this farm, this grazier, is the shift in mindset and the shift in understanding. And again, some of that language, how do we communicate? By that, I mean, how do we describe how animals are going? How do we describe the grazers that we're looking at in terms of how much feed's being taken out of the paddock, recovery periods, quality, and density as well. What's the impact of the animal on the grass, and how many bites on the plant? And seeing those things gestate and ruminate, if you like, in a bloke like Scott, to then see the change that comes out of that over weeks, months, and years, as it turns out, to the point where there are structural changes in the way the place gets farmed and grazed. And one of the points there is simplification of mobs. And sheep. Scott is your archetypal sheep man, right? He could stand up in any pub in any part of the world and talk sheep and beat them down. And that comes with a love affair with separating sheep into different forms and different groups and different mobs. And that then creates complexity in grazing. And Scott has traversed the process of simplifying that. And that was lovely to see his mental model simplify so that he actually had less things to think about by combining some ewes, combining some lambs, getting to the point where, as we've noted here, I recall him saying that just committing to a plan actually changed the way that he thought about how he moved animals around, because ultimately, I think it'd be fair to say that Scott's gone from set stocked, doing the best job he possibly can for every animal on the farm, looking at things through the prism of the animal, individual performance, and not being so fussed about the grass, to then really getting into a rotation of some description, sometimes rotating out of grass, sometimes rotating into grass, sometimes a bit of a mess, sometimes absolutely fantastic, but not really having a system for that, to now, he's getting confident, he's getting familiar, he's got a process for that, he understands recovery period, he understands the metrics around how many paddocks per mob he can require to get where he wants to go, so that he's going into pasture that's had adequate rest, get where he wants to be.
And it was not so much committing to a specific plan of by hook or by crook, I'm doing this, but he's committing to the planning process and thinking that when he's putting animals into the paddock, he's thinking and planning for how he wants that paddock to look when they come out. And I'm just going to draw your attention to this, what many would consider, not necessarily a ridiculously spectacular looking soil, but there's something pretty spectacular going on in that soil. Just talk to that for a moment, Bart.
There's never enough time, is there? One of the key things that the field day talked to, and Scott's journey over the last year or more, has been this differentiation between native soil, native pasture paddocks, native pasture soils, and the improved. There's this very clear distinction. And Scott's moving the needle on his carbon project and his production by upping the ante. And on some of this lighter country, one of the things that stood out as an absolute highlight, on that particular field day, was pulling a core randomly on the top of a lighter hill, and at 70 centimetres having root systems that just were not there 12 months ago, just were not there 2 years ago, punching down into literally 60, 70 centimetre plus zone in what is a bit of a schisty, podzolic soil. And I said, you know what I said? Schisty. Podzolic soil, and it was just outstanding, because that was reflecting back the really fantastic, vigorous multi-species forage that we were seeing above that, which was Scott's way of moving the needle on, a native pasture that was in need of a shift, and then having the management on top of that. And I recall him saying he wants that pasture. He's not going to do it again. It's not like it's a year in, year out deal. That pasture will still be there in 5 years. He'd like to think it'll be there in 20 years. Either way, he's moved the needle on some light country noticeably, visibly
Well, in
in
fact,
12 months.
yeah, some of the highlights for me and also for Scott is just by within 12 months he's starting to actually see the emergence of grasses and so forth that he just didn't think were in existence there anymore. There's not a problem with the seed bank, the seed there, but the plants enable with a bit more recovery
Mm.
and ability to express themselves are turning up.
Yeah, but before we turn to the next one, honestly, that's a common theme for all of those three farms and so many others that are in a pasture improvement world. That whole, whether it be 4, 5, 6, 7 years between coming back around to re-renovate pastures, which is occurring because we've got animals that are just taking that extra bite. And we were looking at it. We've done this with Scott, looking at the pastures, the perennial butts that have been overbitten in the past, to then have that transition and that excitement around seeing perennial plants come back where they were not, but have always been, obviously, because the seed was there, simply because we're changing the way that we think about how animals bite down on grass. And instead of having a never-ending set of bites until the plants disappear, and then, of course, we need to re-renovate, redevelop, re-improve pastures to, invert that, inverse of that. Let's have pastures that we sowed 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, the seed from that come back through based on how we manage our graze.
And we're all really proud of Scott. I mean, something else he makes really clear is that, no one's telling him what to do, but this whole more testing, less guessing, it's just him getting familiar with the numbers that exist, and the patterns that exist on his property that he is very familiar with, but he's able to just quantify and say, without even necessarily stringing up more water and wire, just that simplification of mob structure is improving his mob to paddock ratios, which we know is a critical metric in terms of he's gone from just really looking at the animals to looking at the herbage and the grass production, where previously he may have thought that he's leaving a paddock and wasting grass by leaving it behind, where really what that's doing is just opening up the photosynthetic capacity of the plants to continue to put down those roots like we're looking at on the screen there.
Right, one last thought, right? It's too good because it'll come up in the next one. Percentage of time and recovery. You can look at this in different ways. It's a different way of thinking about recovery time between bites on a plant. But the number I'm recalling for Grovedale was, generally speaking, plants were in recovery, i.e. didn't have someone trying to eat them for 30 to 40% of the time. Doesn't matter which month of the year, growing season, non-growing season, on an ongoing basis. A third of the time, someone's not trying to eat them, which generally means that pastures will run down and need to be resown. Whereas now we're up over 60%. And Scott will say that he wants to be up towards 80% plus because of the way that he's getting his head around how he grazes his grass, which is the fantastic element to all of this. Just the inverse of that rundown pasture syndrome.
With your permission,
please.
may I transition? Thanks, Scott. Love your work. Grovedale, fantastic. I'll see you again soon.
Absolutely.
Bakara, this was just last week, wasn't it? We were at Brewarrina.
Like a cat in a bag. I was stuck in a ute with you for 2 days. Absolutely. It was lovely.
Well, keep it going.
Yeah. Look, I think Graham gave a masterclass. Graham, Kathy, Harriet, the family, Chad, they're to my mind, they are landscape leaders. I step back from a farm like that, and I think we're thinking in terms of decades and generations and long periods of time, not next week, next month, next year. We're really seeing something special out there, and by out there I mean the Western Division. It's a semi-arid, brittle environment. Been through, it's on that tough edge of Western New South Wales, and by tough I mean doesn't rain nearly as much, but when it does, it floods, and it's a fascinating landscape to do what this family do, and it was a masterclass in grazing, and I think that the core take home, and there's so many, but the core take home For me, I get to see a few farms. I get to talk to different people, and I feel very grateful to have the time that I do with people to learn from them, and give when I can. Graham and family have just dramatically simplified the process beyond what I've seen anywhere else, to be honest, in that they have produced the capacity to choose, and they can, they get to choose every which way they look, where animals go to feed, because there's feed in front of them on so many bases, because they've essentially built the ability, the capacity, the infrastructure, the method, the language, the understanding, the confidence to have a very small number of groups of animals, mobs, sometimes one, sometimes two, sometimes three. And when you've got 200 plus paddocks, that becomes a very good place to be when you think about the amount of time that a pasture, a paddock, grass is not going to be grazed, except from the ruse that's coming from country where there's less grass, by the way. So that was the dramatic, in my face, change that I saw since seeing that farm almost 2 years ago, which became evident in seedling emergence, ground cover, plant response. We'll come back to, but I think that simplification this can't be overemphasized.
Talk a little bit about that third bullet point there, annual district graze yields in a day.
I think visiting farms like Bucara Plains people can turn up and it can do their heads in a little bit, because you're looking for the trapdoor, you're looking for why is this so different? We're talking about some country that's got clay pans, we've got floodplain, we've got trees, we've got mitchell grass, we've got salt bush, we've got roos, we've got cattle, and then there's this one group of animals that's moving around, which is having an animal impact on every metre of the paddock that they're in, and they won't be back in that paddock maybe once or twice a year. Now that Graham and the team have developed the system that they have to the point that they have in this last period of time. And to answer your question, in the paddock, I think no one's ever said it more succinctly or simply than Graham explained to those that were in the group when they were trying to get their heads around how the grazing of Bucara Plains really works. The upshot of that is that every hectare that's being grazed there is essentially the same yield as the district average for the year on a per hectare basis. And that struck a few people, but it's actually not that hard to get your head around. If it's only being grazed once or twice a year, that's okay. That means that I'm grazing in a way that takes out a year's worth of harvest, a year's worth of grass, a year's worth of yield in a short period of time, and then I've got a long recovery period, maybe even a year. But actually, for Bucara Plains, Graham and the team have built recovery period up to circa 300 days now, getting on average, not just this paddock or that paddock, but on average across the carbon project, 300 days plus, which just means that you're changing that whole dynamic around who eats the grass and how many bites that Mitchell grass or that salt bush will get through that period of time to then be able to build the reserves into its roots, to then allow the time for the seeds from last week or last decade or, perhaps longer to emerge, which we saw. That was the fascinating and absolutely beautiful thing for me to see, not just old man saltbush popping up as seedling recruits that were not sown, that were not put there by man. They were put there by animal impact and time and patience, whilst still having a solid stocking rate.
I mean, it's hard to fathom really, but by looking at the pictures there, what was there back in '97 is literally.
We're looking at clay pit, right? I mean, that was bare as a bum, bare as your bum, Cole. That's the fascinating, and that's why this farm is such a living laboratory and landscape of beauty. It's had enormous change.
So, big takeaway there, but
well, really, for me personally, it was, there is just so much benefit from simplifying, because I remember being in the paddock again and listening to the various reasons why other people could not have less mobs. And then Graham just kept saying, then to each reason why that's not a good idea, he had a good solution. It was just really simplifying and prioritizing those elements that are there then for the long term and for the duration, while still achieving what you want with the animal, versus always looking through the eyes of the animal and back out the other way and then running out of grass. It was just that simplicity.
And what I also think is pretty incredible about Bacara Plains and Graham, Kathy, Harriet, and Chad is that they see the opportunity to go further. Even in this landscape.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
I think it was the next pit stop, KO2 up the road. Turning again from 70 to 140 paddocks in the next 12 months.
Yep. It's an absolutely fascinating and wonderful property that I think will have, I think you could have a PhD there next week for the next 10 years learning.
So I think it's a good bookend to show the diversity of landscapes in which we're operating, where the viability of a soil carbon project can stack up is absolutely backed off the basis of doing very thorough due diligence to ensure that you've got the right soils, the right scale, the right potential upside of those soils, but on top of that, the management and wherewithal to make a project a viable one. I know we've got a couple of questions come through. We do need to wrap up. We did promise that we'd be sort of 35 minutes or
Yeah, you
so.
talk too much, Cole. Come on.
Now 40 minutes. But the bit of the summary, I'll say a couple and then you chime in, Bart. But essentially, really, what drives a soil carbon project is the uh, grazing enterprise. It's the core business that drives the soil carbon project success, as long as you've got the fundamentals of not putting a project on the soils that are not suitable in the first place, etc. You've really also got to look at soil carbon as another enterprise. So therefore, run an enterprise analysis on soil carbon as you would if you're in sheep and wanting to get into trade cattle. You do the objective analysis, do the numbers on it. That's what we specialise in. But next one over to you.
Well, it doesn't work without the people, and everyone's got to have some buy-in. I think that's the lovely thing about these particular farms, and it's so common but not universal. Simply having that agreement that we're going to move the needle here on this farm. We have a common vision for how it looks in 5, 10, 15 years plus, and we've got a plan for getting there. And that takes the family. It's a wonderful thing.
And while you're at it, you can do the next two as well.
Well, yeah, we don't get change in carbon. We don't move the needle on a carbon project without moving the needle on grass and how we consume it, graze it, obviously. That intersection of livestock, soil, people's decisions, it's where the carbon comes from. That's it. And you don't get animal performance without managing that consciously.
Below ground biomass, Bart.
Well, we're talking about that with Scott, with the plug at 70 centimetres after 12 months. Look, I think people have got to be. That was a bit of an exaggeration in terms of what we would typically see. I think we've got to be patient. We've got to see this thing as a slow burning move of resilience building up in a landscape that's represented by carbon. That means deeper soil systems, deeper root systems, deeper pasture systems, the below ground.
So this is where we're sort of on the off ramp now. We'll come to just those couple of questions in a moment, but really it doesn't cost anything to actually understand whether a soil carbon project may well stack up. So please get in touch and we can run a high level cost benefit analysis, which is all about really saying, is it sensible to go underground to do the proper due diligence, or is your bioregion, is your scale, some of those other prohibitive factors on a project mean that, you know what, don't be distracted by that. Just go and get on with being a fantastic grazier. But where a soil carbon project can stack up, by going through this process, we will absolutely quantify whether it is sensible to get on to ground and do that on ground analysis. So when we do that, it is all about going onto ground, taking a series of soil samples down to 1.2 meters, developing the stratification based on land class and uniformity of land, and then doing the hard numbers on it, doing the agroeconomic analysis on the property, overlaying the grazing enterprise on top, and understanding, okay, well, if we're going to move the needle, how are we going to move the needle? And ultimately, it's the livestock that do that. That's Bart's bread and butter. He's a core part of the team that support running that analysis. Is there anything you want to say on that, Bart?
No, it's a team. We have a big team. We have a good team. We have a strong team. We're a data-driven team. And that's what I love about the fact that we can offset the team on the farm. It's a good balance.
Couldn't agree more. So we've got a couple of questions, and then we'll call it quits for the night. But Ramo, thanks for throwing in these questions. I've got a couple here. Ramo's asked, what's the best time to take samples, growing or non-growing season now, and why, and also how long after the season is the best time to maximise the carbon yield. Now, I'll throw it to you, Bart.
Sure. Fair questions. I really don't think it matters. I think that through the period of a carbon project, it wouldn't matter if you did it on Monday or Tuesday or January or July. Obviously there is some impact depending on the seasonality of the farm that we're talking about, depending on the recent history of the farm that we're talking about, because yes, things will move from Monday to Sunday in a very imperceptible way, and from January to July if there's been a big shift in season. But through the ins and outs of a carbon project, that comes out in the wash. It really does. And I think that it's often misunderstood. It's a good question because it's often misunderstood what the lag is in carbon accrual behind the triggers that create it. Plant pH, plant electrolytes, soil pH, soil electrolytes, they all move in, and as does soil carbon, as does soil calcium, as does soil nitrogen. They all move in response to the biological mechanisms that are driving them, and some of those are faster than others. But carbon is generally going to be a lagging indicator, and it's not one of the influences in a decision-making process that I'd be worried about, to be honest.
Trying to pick the morning or afternoon to put that core down, or the day of the week. We're looking at a 25-year project or so. It's about long-term change. It's about having a long-term view, the long-term management. We'll let everyone get on with their Thursday evening or Wednesday morning if they're in North America, depending what part of the world. But please, we absolutely love you to engage with us. Get on board with the next Stockyard Session podcast that we've have released with Joel Williams. We held a webinar with Joel only a couple of months ago. An incredible communicator on all things soil and the latest science. Hanamino Burrawa down with Charlie Arnott, 10th of December. Can't wait to get down there and do another one of these field days. It's all about grazing performance and really the overlay of a soil carbon project within that context. And another webinar coming up, 16th of December. What happens if your soil carbon project runs into problems? But always new content coming out. But it's been an absolute pleasure. I'll let you give the final words, and if they're not appropriate, then I'll bookend the session now.
Thank you and good night.
Thanks, everyone. Happy grazing, and looking forward to seeing you down at Hanamino.